Here by now, you probably already know that you can't think your way into healing. But my fellow intellectualizers know there's something that happens in healing, especially for those of us who've lived most of our lives in that hyper-aware, intellectualized space. Because what we learned was to stay up in our head and use knowledge and thinking as a way to stay safe, stay disconnected from what feels overwhelming, and stay in connection to others. Oftentimes, that leads us thinking, why am I still stuck? I know all of this stuff. I could teach it myself. I should be further along by now. But the situation is that you can't win that feeling better. And it isn't something you can't move toward what you want for yourself or more connection or more authenticity through purely intellectualized knowledge. So if you're here, you're curious about learning more about how to make realistic change. This is an invitation to explore with me today a way to try on making change in realistic, long-lasting ways by conducting congruence experiments in your life. Now, let's talk about what an experiment is. When I say experiment, I don't mean this cold clinical thing. I'm talking about like a scientific experiment, which if you don't already know, you can't mess up a scientific experiment. A scientific experiment isn't something you can win at. It's something that gives results and information. So you create a hypothesis. I think water turns into a solid when heated. Then you go and heat the water. And when it doesn't turn into a solid, that's not a failure. It just lets you know that your hypothesis in that specific case wasn't true. Water doesn't turn into a solid when heated. Now we make a new hypothesis with the information we have in the present. That works just the same way for our brain, approaching our internal world like a scientist who's not trying to force a particular outcome, because that would be unethical in scientific experiments, but who's curious, who has this deep interest of what's going to happen. Is it going to be this or not this? What if I tweak it just a little bit? Now, is it this or not this? That's how we learn. That's how we create new knowledge and change. So this interest in watching the condition shift, even in the tiniest little ways, actually creates new neural pathways and new emotional learnings in the quickest way possible. So what happens when you try something new, when you try on a little experiment? Not because it's what you think is right, because it's what Instagram told you to do, but because you're curious. What's my system, my brain, and my body going to do when I try this? When I try this one little thing. So let's say you try to set a boundary. You geared up for it. You read all the books on boundaries and codependency. You knew exactly what you wanted to say. Then in the moment, you notice your throat tightening, your body freezing. You didn't say it at all. Maybe you justified why it wasn't the right time. Maybe then you started criticizing yourself, like, I failed. I'm never going to do it differently. Nothing is ever going to change this for me. But from an experiment perspective, we can consider that that moment wasn't a failure. It's information. And information is what allows our brain to shift and form new neural pathways. That's actually a perfect data point in your experiment about what happens in your life, in your thoughts, emotions, and body sensations when you try to show up for yourself and have a boundary. So we literally get to observe in real time or retroactively after it happened, which is normal. We collect data, then we observe it. We get to observe our emotional learnings, our neural pathways, our predictive patterns, and our adaptive strategies that have kept us safe in the past, but that we might want to shift now. And this is how we create change. Even if we're observing in that moment that we panicked when we went to set the boundary, even if we're observing later that day or later that week, like we don't even realize that we felt all those things until later on, we're still observing the experiment and the results, and that still updates our brain. It's really common that the retroactive observation is what will happen, looking back later when you're starting to do this work, because observing in real time isn't yet a practice. It's not a neural pathway in your brain. So it's normal to observe minutes, days, hours, even weeks later. But that looking back at that moment where a patterned response took over and then noticing what happens, not in a judgmental way, but in a scientific way, like a wildlife documentarian, if you've heard me talk about that before. You get to track moment by moment exactly what happened and where the neural pathway started to go into an old safety pattern, an old adaptive pattern that shuts you down to keep you safe. This process still allows us to update that map of our brain to notice these strategies from a present place, from our adult consciousness, from our observer self, and consider how we might want it to be different and why it hasn't felt safe for it to be different, what we learned in our earlier lives that made this feel like the right choice, and what we want to be different now. This is one of the core shifts in remapping our inner world. It's not about being perfect. It's literally about observing these predictive patterns, these neural pathways in your brain that have been running the show, and saying, I want to start to build new roadways. We know building new roadways doesn't happen overnight. We have to start cutting down vines to start, but it's possible. It is possible with these experiments to start to build these new little roadways, little bits at a time, and say, maybe I'm not going to take the safety roadway today. And then we go towards a new roadway and our brain says no. And it takes us back to the safety pathway. Again, it's an experiment. It's not a failed experiment. It's information. What happened in that moment? You can't mess it up. And there's no right way to do it. There's only this moment, then the next moment, then the next moment, and the information we can take in from our thoughts, emotions, and body sensations. This is where we begin. So when I talk about a coherence experiment, I don't mean something formal or clinical. I mean these tiny little everyday moments. They're happening all of the time, where we get to observe what our system is predicting is going to happen and whether that holds true or not. So it's basically bumping up against one of our old roads, our old neural pathways, one of those survival routes that your nervous system, brain, and body built long ago. And we're pausing to notice, just in the moment, is what my brain is predicting to happen actually going to happen? So we're not trying to force a change or force you into doing something through behavioral gripping or through trying to change your cognitions. Instead, we're being curious while we're in the experience or after the experience. So let's say you have this impulse to apologize for something you didn't do wrong. It could be with a friend, it could be at work, but this is your old pathway. This is your old route. If anything feels uncertain or tense at any moment, you should apologize and try to make it right and try to make everyone comfortable. That's an old route. That's a survival route. That's an emotional learning that has become automatic because your brain predicts that that's going to help you avoid conflict, avoid whatever's going to happen, and stay safe in unpredictable and chaotic environments. So, a coherence experiment or a congruence experiment could look like pausing and noticing the urge to over apologize. Like maybe it's via chat or text and you type this whole message of, I'm so sorry that happened and I'll do this next time. And maybe just for that moment, you wait for 10 seconds, you pause and you notice the urgency to over apologize. And maybe you notice that your body is panicking, like you feel like there's an emergency happening in the moment. So what happens? Are you guilting yourself? What are you saying is going to happen? Are you actually unsafe in that moment? That's a little experiment that inserts a pause in between your impulse of your old survival pathway and the present. And that's the experiment. Because if your body and brain are saying the whole world is going to collapse, if you don't jump in and apologize and make this better, even though it's not your fault, what happens in the 10 seconds? Does the world collapse? Does your friend say they never want to be your friend again? Do you get fired? And yes, just in those 10 seconds, it actually helps our neural pathways fire in a different direction. So it's not about succeeding or failing. Even if after the 10 seconds you go in and you still apologize and try to make it okay, that little pause of noticing, oh, could I actually be safe in this moment? Is what I'm feeling actually happening? Or is it an old learning? Is it an old road? Many times we will take the old road. We will over apologize. We will intellectualize. We will be perfectionist and shame ourselves. Sometimes you'll try the new road. You'll pause. You won't immediately go into the over apologizing, but then you'll immediately retreat, or then you'll feel really anxious for the rest of the day. None of that is failure. It's normal and expected. Your brain is trying to predict what's going to keep you safe, and updating those predictions, it takes time here in the present. And it takes noticing in that space between what your brain says is going to happen and what's actually happening. Are there actually tigers or are they cats? And they look like tigers because I'm wearing these survival lenses of an old pathway. So this information that your system has learned to protect you and what it believes is going to happen is often very different from what is actually happening in the moment. And these experiments allow us to observe that and thus start cutting down those vines to form new roads. So I just think this takes so much pressure off this healing process of trying to get it perfect and trying to know everything and trying harder and changing our thoughts and changing our behaviors and forcing presence and forcing change, which usually doesn't last because our brain and body has a survival response and brings us back to what's safe. We have to go about it the other way. We have to look at those behaviors, those symptoms, as exactly that, symptoms that something inside of us isn't feeling safe. When we build roads of safety, when we let our brain know having needs, for example, is safe, we can build a new road that's coded as safe, then the survival response won't happen and we won't have to try so hard. So you can think about these coherence experiments as updating our GPS routes. It's like rerouting. It's trying to find a new safe pathway, and it might be building new roads while it's doing that. So it's so cool that we can update our brain's GPS. We can update our brain's maps or atlases. But just like in real life, building new roadways takes time. And doing these coherence experiments are these real life moments of construction. We're literally doing construction in our brain where we're saying, I see what's happening. I wonder what could happen if I try something new. Even just the imagining of trying something new without you doing it, that is building new routes in your brain. One of the most important things I want to say about this experimental process, and yes, I know I've said it many times, you can't mess it up. You really cannot mess it up because it's information, it's results. And with those results, we can run another experiment. You can't fail at being curious or noticing or observing. Even if the experiment doesn't go the way you hoped because you were putting pressure on yourself to do the new thing, it still counts. It's still updating those routes in your brain, and you're still learning something. Because as much as I hate to say it, living is not about outcomes, and these experiments are not about outcomes. We can make therapy this very outcome-based process. I have to change all my behaviors and get to all these things, but it's not about the outcomes. It's about gathering. So maybe you could consider asking yourself today, what's the destination that I keep imagining for myself, but I won't let myself reach for it? I won't even let myself say it. Is it rest? Is it more connection? Is it creativity? Is it being truly understood? Is it just having a little more ease in your life? What's it like to imagine that right now in your thoughts, emotions, and body sensations? Just imagining that is an experiment because what comes up? What starts to make it feel so far away? Do you criticize yourself? Does your body tense up? What's one moment you can remember where you turned away from yourself before you even knew you were doing it? What was happening in that moment? What do you think your brain and body were afraid was going to happen? What was the tiger that your brain perceived in that moment? Was it shame? Was it conflict? Was it disappointment? Where might I have learned that in the past? How is it different in the present? Has there been a recent moment where you responded differently? You spoke up, or you softened, or you took care of yourself in a small way, or you shut down a little bit less, or you asked for what you need, or you thought about asking for what you need. What was new about that moment? How did it feel in the moment? And how does it feel to think about it now? If you wanted to add one new roadway to your atlas that took you toward the destination that you might be wanting, what would it be? What do you imagine would happen on that roadway? Where would it take you? And what do you notice in this moment? That is what we are curious about together. Noticing, observation, and little experiments, one tiny bit at a time. So the best thing is that doing these little experiments doesn't require you to be fully regulated or healed or ready, whatever those terms might mean. It's like an archaeological dig where we're just getting our paintbrush out and we're marking off a 1 foot by 1 foot square, and we're taking off these little layers at a time. We might not know what's underneath or what to do with what's underneath, but it will become clear as we continue to work down through those layers, as we continue to form new roadways. So what do we need to conduct these experiments? We need the capacity to observe neutrally, or at least slightly neutrally, and be curious. And even if it's 1%, we can observe and be curious, and 99%, it's shutting down and criticizing and going up into our head, or 0.01% of being curious, It's still enough to do the experiment because you don't have to get it right. There is no getting it right.